There are moments in history when a quiet land begins to speak with thunder. And in the red earth of Burkina Faso, that voice rose, steady, young, and unshaken, in the person of Ibrahim Traoré. He did not come with fanfare or fortune. He came with a vision that Africa should no longer borrow her strength, but build it with her own hands. From the dust of forgotten factories, from the silence of abandoned quarries, he raised a movement, not of words but of work. A new industrial dawn began to glow where many had only seen darkness, and the West, so used to being the builder, turned its eyes in disbelief. For from the heart of a small nation came a power large enough to supply 12. This is not just a story of cement. This is a story of rebirth. The story of the Burkina Faso president and the fire of Ibrahim Traoré's achievement that is reshaping the meaning of power across a continent. Part 1. The beginning of a vision. They say destiny often comes wrapped in silence. And in that silence, somewhere in the heat of Ouagadougou, a young soldier looked beyond the politics, beyond the poverty, and saw something the world had forgotten, the dignity of work. He was not born into wealth. He did not inherit an empire. He rose from the soil, the same red earth that stains the hands of every Burkina farmer. And in those hands he saw not weakness, but strength, unrealized, waiting to be awakened. Ibrahim Traoré looked upon his country, and he did not see limitation. He saw foundation. He said to his people, "We have been told we are poor. But what is poverty when the ground beneath us holds the power to build nations?" When he became the Burkina Faso president, the world called him too young, too bold, too inexperienced. But sometimes the wisdom of nations does not come from age, it comes from courage. He saw the roads half-built, the bridges unfinished, the dependence on foreign cement that choked every dream before it could stand tall. He saw how each bag of imported cement carried not only cost, but humiliation. It was as if the very bones of the country were being built by someone else's permission, and so he asked the question that few dared to ask. Why must we keep buying the foundation of our own freedom? From that question came a vision. To build not just factories but a future, he called upon engineers, young minds, local investors, and even skeptics. He said, "Let us make the ground beneath our feet our greatest ally." And people laughed at first. They said, "This is impossible. Burkina Faso cannot compete with the giants of the West or the East." But faith, my brothers and sisters, faith does not bow to statistics. Traoré knew the mountain was high, but he also knew the higher the climb, the clearer the view. He began by reclaiming old sites, once abandoned by colonial companies. He gathered the remains of broken machinery and called upon African ingenuity to repair, rebuild, redesign. It started small, a single plant in the outskirts of Ouagadougou. But from that dust rose a sound, the sound of machines, of hope turning into production, of dreams being fired in kilns hotter than the desert sun. In the quiet corners of his nation, a revolution had begun, not with guns, not with slogans, but with limestone, steel, and sweat. And the West, they did not notice. Not yet, because revolutions that come from the heart of the people do not announce themselves. They rise in silence before shaking the world. When the first factory began producing locally made cement, Traoré didn't celebrate with fireworks. He walked among his workers, men and women whose hands were white with dust, whose faces glowed with pride, and said, "This dust upon you is the proof of freedom. For every grain of cement we make is a piece of our sovereignty." He knew it was only the beginning. He knew greater storms were coming. But he also knew, once a people learn they can build, they can never again be conquered. And as the furnaces burned and the belts rolled, something larger than production began to stir. A sense of ownership, a birth of national confidence. The young president was no longer just leading a country, he was awakening a continent. But soon this quiet miracle would no longer remain a secret. For what began in the heart of one nation would soon reach 12. And the world would turn, startled, to ask, how did this happen? Part 2. The Rise of the Empire. They called it ambition. They said it was too grand for a land too small, too poor, too dependent. But Traore, that young son of Burkina Faso, he called it faith in action. He did not build with arrogance, he built with purpose. And purpose, my brothers and sisters, is stronger than any sanction, any criticism, any shadow cast from afar. When the first cement plant reached full capacity, he did not pause to rest. He looked to the horizon and said, "If we can supply one province, we can supply a nation. If we can supply a nation, we can supply a continent." So began the rise. Slow, steady, unstoppable. He sought out local engineers, men and women whose talents had long been overlooked, buried beneath the weight of imported expertise. He said, "You do not need to wait for permission to be great. You already are." And those words, simple yet sacred, set fire to hearts across the nation. Students in technical schools began to dream not of leaving, but of building. Traders started investing not in foreign brands, but in their own soil. Communities began donating land, labor, even meals, because they knew this was not just a company. This was a cause. The plants multiplied, 2, then 3, then 5. Each one not a monument to power, but a testimony of perseverance. And from those furnaces came not only cement, but confidence. The villages near the plants became towns. The roads that led to the factories became arteries of commerce, carrying life where once there was dust and despair. Children walked to school beside the rumble of trucks, and for the first time, they saw a future that looked like them. And across the borders, neighbors began to notice. Mali asked for a shipment. Niger sent word of interest. Ghana wanted a deal. One by one, 12 nations came to the table, not as dependents, but as partners. When the first convoy of Burkina Faso cement crossed into foreign land, it was not just trade, it was triumph. For generations, African nations had imported the very bones of their cities. But now, from the heart of the Sahel, a new provider had risen. And when the Western observers saw the numbers, the tonnage, the expansion, the capacity, they blinked in disbelief. Because this was not aid. This was not charity. This was competition. African, proud, efficient, and growing. Some called it a miracle. But Traore said, "It is not a miracle when a people finally believe in themselves." And so the empire grew. Not in palaces, but in production. Not in opulence, but in output. Each bag of cement became a symbol, each shipment a statement. Africa can build her own future. The Western press began to circle, trying to understand how such growth was possible. They said, surely there must be foreign investors behind it. But no. The funding came from within. The spirit came from within. The will came from within. It was not built by outsiders. It was forged by faith. And as the factories lit up the nights of the Sahel, the skyline itself seemed to whisper, "We are no longer the subjects of someone else's story." Traore traveled to each site, walking shoulder to shoulder with workers. He would pause beside the roaring machinery, lay his hand on the warm metal, and say, "This, my brothers, is the sound of freedom." And though the world didn't yet fully understand, those who lived it, they knew. They knew they were witnessing the birth of something sacred, a new chapter not only for Burkina Faso, but for an entire continent long underestimated. But as the empire rose, so did the attention, and not all eyes that turned toward Burkina Faso looked with admiration. Some looked with fear. Because the day Africa begins to build for herself, someone else begins to lose control. Part 3. The Shock and the Response. The West did not believe it at first. They thought the reports were exaggerated, the kind of patriotic boasting that fades with time. But time, my friends, has a way of revealing the truth. When the production figures arrived, millions of tons of cement flowing from plants across Burkina Faso and beyond, silence fell in certain rooms where power once felt secure. 12 nations, 12 supply lines, one African name at the center, Ibrahim Traoré. They looked again, ran the numbers twice. How can a landlocked nation, they asked, become a regional supplier of industry? How indeed? Because what they forgot, what they never understood, was that vision cannot be contained by borders. And so, the West was shocked. Not because Africa had failed, but because Africa had succeeded without them. Television anchors spoke his name with disbelief. Editorials tried to rationalize the impossible. They said it must be Chinese funding, or Russian machines, or Middle Eastern investment. But when the dust settled, the truth remained simple. It was Africa's own hands. This was no proxy empire. This was a Burkina Faso president building with conviction, not concession. And, oh, the reaction came. Some came cloaked in diplomacy, polite concern, talk of economic balance, and regional stability. Others came in whispers, warnings, restrictions, the quiet threat of sanctions, because power, once challenged, never smiles in silence. But Traoré did not waver. He spoke not with anger, but with clarity. He said, "When we build, we are not declaring war, we are declaring independence." And across the continent, leaders began to echo his words. In Mali, in Niger, in Guinea, the phrase became a rhythm. We are building our freedom. Even the youth in the diaspora began to chant his name online. In churches across Atlanta and Detroit, old men nodded and said, "This young man, he reminds me of the dream we used to talk about." It was no longer about cement. It was about a continent rediscovering her dignity. Factories stood tall like cathedrals of industry. The chimneys became new steeples, symbols of labor, faith, and rebirth. And every truck that left those gates carried more than building material. It carried pride. Yet the world's reaction was not all admiration. Some in the West felt unease. Economists predicted market disruption. Corporations saw unwelcome competition, and politicians whispered about a growing nationalist movement in Africa. But you and I, we know what that means. It means the ground beneath their feet has begun to shift. Because the day a man stops renting his power and starts producing it, that's the day he stops asking for permission to exist. Traoré understood the weight of this moment. He knew the eyes of the world were on him, not with applause, but with calculation. Yet, when asked if he feared their reaction, he said simply, "A nation cannot fear progress. We are not seeking approval. We are seeking growth." Those words, they traveled far. They were repeated in classrooms, in radio shows, in prayer circles. They became a kind of gospel of self-reliance. And somewhere in a boardroom far away, a Western executive whispered, "If they can do cement, they can do steel. If they can do steel, they can do energy." Fear was not loud. It was quiet, strategic, real. Because what they witnessed was not just an economic shift. It was a psychological revolution. A continent beginning to believe in its own reflection again. Ibrahim Traoré's achievement had become more than industrial. It was spiritual. It reminded millions that Africa's story was never about capacity. It was about permission. And now, permission was no longer being asked. Factories expanded, exports increased, and the label "Made in Burkina Faso" began to appear on construction sites from Dakar to Abidjan. And in that moment, something ancient stirred. The pride of ancestors, the promise of unity, the pulse of destiny. But every light casts a shadow. And as Traoré's empire grew brighter, the pressure around him began to tighten. For in the halls of power beyond the ocean, plans were being made, not to celebrate his success, but to contain it. Part 4. The Global Echo. When a new wind blows across the desert, it does not stay in one place. It travels, across borders, across hearts, across oceans. And the wind that began in Burkina Faso, that wind carried the name Traoré. It whispered through the Sahel, swept across West Africa, and soon the world began to hear its sound. In the markets of Bamako, traders spoke his name with respect. In the classrooms of Accra, teachers spoke of a Burkinabe model. And in the radio stations of Lagos, young hosts declared, "Africa is rising, and it's not from loans, it's from labor." Even far away across the Atlantic, in the churches of Atlanta and Baltimore, pastors began to weave his name into sermons about renewal. They said, "Brothers and sisters, if a young man from a small African nation can rise and build, then who are we to stop believing?" That is when it became more than politics. It became prophecy. In Europe, the tone changed. Some analysts spoke of a new African industrial bloc. Others warned that the geopolitical balance is shifting. But the people of Africa didn't care for balance. They cared for belonging. For the first time in a long while, Africans abroad felt pride that was not nostalgic, but now. They saw a living leader not just speaking of liberation, but building it, brick by brick, block by block. Universities in France hosted debates titled, "Can Traoré's model redefine African economics?" In Washington, a senator remarked, "We may be witnessing the start of an industrial independence we underestimated." And the Western media, hesitant but curious, began to change their tone. From doubt to study. Because you see, when dignity becomes productive, it cannot be ignored. Every nation that received Burkinabe cement felt a quiet inspiration that maybe, just maybe, the age of dependence was closing. Traoré, though young, became a mirror. And when people looked into that mirror, they did not just see him. They saw themselves. He stood not as a man against the world, but as a symbol of what the world once told Africa she could never be: industrial, independent, and in control. And so the echo grew, from factory floors to parliaments, from small villages to global think tanks. His message rippled outward. We are not late to progress. Progress was late to see us. But echoes, no matter how wide they travel, always return home. And as the noise of praise and criticism reached him, Traoré faced the question that every leader of destiny must face: what comes after victory? Part 5. The Road Ahead. Every great story reaches a crossroad, the place where triumph meets tomorrow. And there, standing at that junction, is Ibrahim Traoré. He has built factories, created jobs, lifted a nation's pride, and shaken the old order. But now the question is no longer, can we build? It is, what shall we build next? For a foundation, no matter how strong, is only the beginning. Traoré knows this. He speaks not of cement alone, but of transformation, of steel, energy, agriculture, technology. He speaks of an Africa that will no longer measure her worth by the weight of her exports, but by the strength of her creation. He once said, "When we make cement, we build walls, but when we make unity, we build nations." And so, his vision expands. Factories will rise beside solar fields. Young engineers will learn not only to follow blueprints, but to design their own. Women will lead supply chains. Communities will co-own industries. Because in the new world, Traore imagines, power does not come from permission. It comes from participation. But the road ahead will not be smooth. Old powers rarely fade quietly. The pressure will increase, diplomatically, economically, even internally. There will be whispers of discontent, tests of loyalty, storms of misinformation, and yet, every generation has its builders. And perhaps this one, under his leadership, has found its purpose. For the dream of Burkina Faso is no longer just to stand, it is to lead. In the years ahead, the question will not be whether Africa can compete, but whether the world can keep up. And to those who doubt, Traoré offers no anger, no arrogance, only resolve. He says, "We will keep producing, we will keep teaching, we will keep believing." Because nations, like people, rise not when they are invited, but when they are inspired. He stands now, not as a lone figure, but as the face of a movement that has reminded millions that freedom does not come from what you buy, but from what you build. And as the dust of progress settles over the Sahel, one can almost hear the echo of tomorrow in the hum of his factories, the steady, unbroken rhythm of a continent remembering who it truly is. For if the story of Burkina Faso has taught us anything, it is this. When one nation dares to build its own destiny, the whole world must build anew or be left behind. Conclusion: the message and the miracle. When the story of this century is written, there will be a chapter titled Burkina Faso, and beneath that title, one name will be carved with pride: Ibrahim Traoré, for he did not seek to be a hero. He sought to be a builder, and sometimes that is the greater calling. He showed us that leadership is not about height or age, but about vision, that a single spark of courage can set a whole continent aflame with purpose. The Burkina Faso president taught the world that the true wealth of a nation is not hidden in its mines or under its soil. It lives in the will of its people, in the sweat upon their hands, in the dust of their work. And his greatest victory is not the empire itself, but the awakening it inspired. The idea that Africa's destiny is not a debt to be paid, but a dream to be built. That, my brothers and sisters, is the real Ibrahim Traoré achievement. For too long, others have told Africa what she cannot do. But this time, the lesson travels in the other direction. Now the world must learn from her resilience, her renewal, her rise. The machines may slow, the headlines may fade, but what Traoré has set in motion will not stop. Because once a people remember their power, they cannot forget it again. And so, as the sun sets over Ouagadougou and the factories hum into the night, a new music fills the air. Not the sound of protest, but of progress, the sound of a continent working, building, believing. The West may have been shocked by Beck's, but Africa has been awakened. And to you, watching this story unfold, I ask, if Burkina Faso can rise from the dust to build an empire of creation, what then can we build in our homes, in our hearts, in our time? Because the legacy of the Burkina Faso president is not just his cement, it is his conviction. And that conviction belongs to all who believe that freedom is not something given. It is something built. If this story moved your spirit, share it. Let the world know what's rising in Africa. Subscribe to this channel, join this movement, and together, let's keep telling the stories that the world was never meant to forget.